The phone rang just as I was walking out of the kitchen preparing to grab a cup of coffee. The caller ID read unknown. I didn't pick up. I never did when it was from a number I didn't recognize. But then the voicemail came through. My heart dropped when I heard the first words. "This is Officer Daniels from the local sheriff's department. I'm afraid you need to get to the hospital immediately. Your son's been involved in an altercation. He's been hurt." My legs went out from under me and I dropped the phone. Something in the pit of my stomach told me I was too late. Too late for what? I didn't know yet. But I could feel it. I could feel my world slipping away. And all of it, started with a woman named Karen. My son Ethan was everything to me. He wasn't just my kid. He was my heart walking around outside my body. And it wasn't easy for him. Ethan was born with cerebral palsy. It wasn't something we knew at first. He was a happy, smiling baby, the kind of kid who loved to laugh and play with his stuffed animals. But when he hit a certain age and still couldn't walk, couldn't even sit up by himself, we started to worry. After a long series of doctor's visits, tests, and appointments, we got the diagnosis. It hit us like a freight train, but we made a decision then. We weren't going to let it define him. Ethan was still Ethan. My little boy with the bright blue eyes and the endless curiosity. The fact that he couldn't walk didn't mean he didn't have a voice. It didn't mean he didn't have dreams. Every day we did physical therapy. Every day we fought. I watched him struggle, sweat, and cry, and each time it broke my heart. But there was always a new sense of pride when he could sit up on his own for a few minutes longer or lift his arms higher. I remember his first words clearly. They weren't as easy as other kids might have been. But when he finally said, "Mama," it felt like I'd just won the lottery. And every new milestone, no matter how small, felt like a victory. We lived in a small suburban neighborhood in a house we'd just moved into. We wanted to give Ethan a sense of security and a place to grow. It was a quiet neighborhood, the kind where people minded their business. Or so I thought. When we moved in, I had no idea just how much a simple HOA could change our lives. It wasn't until the third week in our new house that I first met Karen. She showed up at the door one afternoon, her heels clicking against the concrete driveway. I was in the middle of helping Ethan with some toys on the front porch when I saw her approaching. Her smile was wide, but there was something sharp about it, almost predatory. She handed me a stack of pamphlets and introduced herself with the kind of politeness that made me instantly suspicious. "I'm Karen, the HOA president," she said, extending her hand. "We like to keep the neighborhood running smoothly here. You know, rules and all." I didn't know much about homeowners associations, but I nodded, taking her hand. "Nice to meet you." "I'm Sarah, and this is Ethan," I said, gesturing to my son who was sitting on the porch with his toy cars. Karen's eyes flickered to Ethan, but it was brief. She didn't seem to care that he was different, that he had needs, that he was fighting every single day to do things other kids did without even thinking about it. Instead, her gaze drifted to the pamphlets in her hands. "We take great pride in keeping things orderly here," she said, her voice oozing with a kind of forced sweetness. "There are a few rules about the common areas, like how long you can keep your trash cans out, and, of course, noise levels. We've had complaints in the past about the noise levels during certain hours. Kids running around, playing outside. It can get a bit much for some of the neighbors." I swallowed hard, my fingers tightening on the stack of papers she'd handed me. Ethan was just sitting there, innocently playing with his toy cars, unaware of the tension rising between us. I took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. "Ethan loves being outside," I said, my voice steady but defensive. "We're just enjoying the sun. He doesn't get to do this much, so I try to let him when I can." Karen didn't smile this time. Her eyes narrowed slightly, though she quickly smoothed over the reaction with another stiff smile. Of course. but if it's loud, it's something we might have to address. She didn't even seem to see Ethan, just the idea of him existing outside her perfect little world. As she turned to leave, she gave one last lingering glance toward him as if he was somehow out of place. "Just something to think about," she called back, before walking away. I wasn't sure what to make of the encounter, but I was bothered. Karen was just a woman who had too much time on her hands trying to control things that weren't hers to control. I pushed it to the back of my mind and went back to focusing on Ethan, trying to ignore the uncomfortable feeling Karen left behind, but that wasn't the last time I saw her. It was a week later when she knocked on our door again. This time, she wasn't holding a pamphlet. She didn't need to. Her message was clear. "I've noticed something about your son," Karen said, crossing her arms tightly over her chest as she looked past me at Ethan, who was sitting in the living room. He was humming quietly to himself, his wheelchair next to the window where the sun filtered through. I tensed. "What about him?" "He's loud," she said, her voice cold now, like she was making an official complaint. "And I've received complaints from other neighbors. I don't know if you've noticed, but it's disturbing to some people. He's out here all the time, and that's not what this neighborhood's about." My heart sank. My throat tightened, but I forced myself to stay calm. Ethan enjoys being outside. He doesn't get many opportunities to just be a kid. He's allowed to make noise. Karen didn't look convinced. "Maybe he shouldn't be out here so much then," she said, her words sharp and cutting. "Some of the neighbors don't appreciate it, and I'm sure you can imagine how that looks for the community." "His condition doesn't change the fact that he deserves a little joy, Karen," I said, feeling my patience slipping. Her eyes narrowed. "I'll be keeping an eye on it," she said, her tone threatening. "If things don't improve, I'll have to take this higher." I stood there, frozen for a moment, the words hanging in the air like a fog. Was she seriously trying to tell me how to raise my son, how to give him joy? I opened my mouth to say something, but Karen had already turned and was marching off, her heels clicking with finality as she disappeared down the street. From that moment on, it was clear to me that this wasn't just about noise or inconvenience. This was about power, about control. And she wasn't going to stop. A few days later, I was out in the yard with Ethan when I saw Karen again. She was standing in her driveway, arms crossed, eyes trained on us. She wasn't hiding it anymore. Her surveillance had begun. Every day she was watching us from her porch, always looking for an excuse to come over and make some sort of complaint. Ethan, completely unaware of the tension between us, was laughing, playing with his toy cars, rolling them across the pavement. I had set up a ramp for him, something simple, just a few planks of wood for him to roll his cars down. It was something we'd done together the day before, and he was so happy to do it again. But Karen didn't see happiness. She saw a disruption. I heard her voice before I saw her. "Is your son outside again?" she asked, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. I turned around, keeping my tone level. "Yes, Karen. He's outside, playing, just like any other kid." She wasn't backing down. "This is becoming a problem. People are talking about it. You need to keep him inside." I could feel the heat rising in my chest, my blood pressure spiking with every word. "He's a kid. He deserves to be outside. You don't get to dictate his life." She scoffed, rolling her eyes. "Maybe you should start taking this more seriously, or there will be consequences." Her words hung in the air, suffocating me. She wasn't just talking about noise anymore. She was talking about control, about taking away something that should have been a right, my son's right to be a kid. I had no idea what she'd do next, but I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just an HOA issue anymore. This was personal. The tension had been building for weeks. Every day felt like a quiet countdown. with Karen lurking in the background, waiting for the next opportunity to strike. At first, I thought maybe she was just someone with too much time on her hands, trying to make the world around her conform to some ideal version of perfection. But it became clear that she wasn't just watching for noise, she was watching for anything she could use to punish us. It was a bright Tuesday afternoon when I realized just how far she was willing to go. Ethan and I were out front again, as usual. The sun was shining down and there was a soft breeze rustling the leaves in the trees. It was a good day, one of those rare moments where everything felt right. Ethan was rolling his toy cars across the driveway, laughing quietly to himself as he sat in his wheelchair. He was happy. That's all that mattered to me. But then I heard the footsteps. I turned to see Karen standing at the edge of her driveway, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her face a hard mask of disapproval. She was watching us again, and I could see the anger brewing in her eyes. She'd been simmering for weeks, but today something in her expression was different. There was a cruelty in her gaze, something almost vindictive. She didn't even wait for me to say anything before she spoke. "You've got to be kidding me," she said, her voice cold, almost clipped. "I told you to keep him inside, and yet here you are again, letting him disturb the peace." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Karen," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "he's not disturbing anyone. He's a child playing outside. That's what kids do." She scoffed, shaking her head in a way that made me feel like she was somehow better than me. "You don't get it, do you? This is a nice neighborhood. People don't want to be bothered by your son's noise. It's that simple." I could feel my hands balling into fists at my sides. I wasn't sure whether to scream or to cry. "You don't know anything about him. You don't know what it's like to watch your child fight every single day just to be a kid." Her lips curled into a thin smile, a smile that made my blood boil. "Maybe you should focus on keeping him inside, where he belongs." I'm tired of giving you chances I didn't know what to say. I couldn't reason with her. I was so angry, I could barely think straight. It was clear she wasn't going to back down. She didn't care about Ethan, about me, or about the fact that this was our home. She was only concerned with her idea of order, and that order didn't include us. She took a few steps closer, her gaze never leaving me. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "You're going to regret not listening to me." And then she turned, walking away without another word. But as she walked off, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. I wasn't sure if she was just threatening me or if she was serious, but the way she spoke, the venom in her words, made me feel like something was about to happen, something bigger than I was ready for. I tried to push it out of my mind, but it stayed there, a weight. Every time Ethan and I went outside, I felt the eyes on us, the silent judgment from Karen. It was as if her presence was hanging over our heads like a storm cloud, ready to burst at any moment. Then, 2 days later, I heard the unmistakable sound of Karen's voice again, cutting through the air like a knife. "This is it," she said, her voice louder than before. I turned to see her walking down the driveway, her face set in a determined scowl. She wasn't alone this time. Behind her, a man stood with his arms folded. He was tall, broad-shouldered, someone I hadn't seen before. But from the way Karen was speaking, it was clear he was there for a reason. "You need to get him inside," Karen said, her voice like ice. "Now. He's causing a disturbance again, and if you don't do something about it, I'll be forced to take action." I stood up, my heart pounding in my chest. "I told you, Karen. He's just playing. He's a child. You have no right to tell me what to do with my son." The man behind Karen, who had been silent up until that point, finally spoke up. "We've received multiple complaints from your neighbors. The HOA is within its rights to issue a formal warning. If you don't comply, there will be consequences." The words, "consequences," hit me like a slap in the face. My son didn't deserve to be treated this way. He wasn't doing anything wrong, and yet Karen was acting like he was some sort of criminal. "I'm not keeping him inside, Karen," I said, my voice shaking with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "You don't get to control my son's life. You're not his mother, and you don't know what he's been through." The man stepped forward, his posture stiff, his arms still folded across his chest. "This isn't personal. It's about the neighborhood. We have rules, and if you don't follow them, we'll have no choice but to take further action. The HOA board will decide what to do next." At that moment, something inside me snapped. It wasn't just about the noise anymore. It wasn't just about Karen. It was about Ethan, my son, the little boy who had fought so hard for everything he had, everything he'd earned. He deserved better than this. He deserved to live without fear, without someone trying to tear him down just because they didn't like the way he existed. I took a deep breath, but before I could say anything else, I heard the engine of a truck roar down the street. And I knew who it was. Jason's truck screeched to a halt at the curb. The engine cut off with a finality that made everything feel like it was happening in slow motion. I saw him before he even got out, his tall frame, his military uniform still sharp and crisp, even though he'd been away for months. But this time, he wasn't just a husband. He wasn't just a Marine coming home. He was a father, a protector, and he wasn't happy. The engine of Jason's truck had barely come to a stop when he was already out of the cab, his boots slamming into the pavement. He didn't even glance in my direction. His eyes were locked onto Karen, his expression fierce, like a man used to being in control. A Marine with no patience for nonsense. I stood frozen for a second, my heart pounding, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on me. But I wasn't the one who needed to act now. Jason was here. He took a single, long stride forward, his jaw clenched tightly, the muscles in his neck taut with anger. It wasn't a typical display of rage. This was something more controlled, more dangerous. He had been trained for moments like these, trained to handle threats with precision, but this was personal. "You stay away from my family," Jason growled, his voice low but filled with authority, enough to make Karen pause in her tracks. Karen blinked, clearly surprised by his sudden appearance. "Who do you think you are?" she snapped, stepping forward, trying to regain some semblance of control. "This is an HOA matter. Your son—" "My son is not your problem," Jason interrupted her, his voice cutting through the air with the force of a thunderclap. He took another step closer, and the man standing next to Karen, I assumed he was some other HOA member or a hired enforcer, shifted uncomfortably, but didn't say a word. Jason wasn't finished. "Don't you dare talk about my son like that again," Jason said, his voice dangerously calm. But the intensity behind it was clear. His words hit like a fist. "You think you can come into my family's life and dictate how we live? You think you can just tear us apart with your petty rules?" Karen didn't back down. "This is a neighborhood issue," she spat, her face twisted with anger. But there was something in her voice that wavered now. "You're making this worse than it has to be." Jason's eyes were like steel, unwavering as he took another step forward. "You've hurt my family," he said, each word deliberate. "You've hurt my son. And if you think I'm going to stand here and let you keep doing it, you're sadly mistaken." The air around us seemed to crackle with tension, the world holding its breath. Karen didn't know what to say. She was used to getting her way. She was used to making people back down. But this time, she wasn't in control. This time, there was something more powerful standing against her. Karen looked toward the man beside her, as if silently asking for support. But he remained silent, clearly unwilling to step into the fray. Jason didn't wait for Karen to say anything else. He stepped forward, his eyes never leaving hers. "You're done here. You're not going to hurt my family anymore, and you're not going to hurt my son." There was a long silence, thick with the weight of the moment. And then, without another word, Jason turned and motioned for me to come inside with Ethan. I felt a surge of emotion rush through me, relief, pride, and fear all at once. My heart was still racing, but I felt like I could breathe again. I turned and walked back inside with Ethan, making sure to lock the door behind us. But I knew this wasn't over. The fight was far from finished. But just as I was closing the door, I heard Karen's voice again. "I'm not done with you," she called out, her voice shaking with fury. "You'll regret this." Her words hung in the air as I shut the door behind me. Inside, Ethan was sitting on the couch, his hands resting on his toy cars. He looked up at me, his blue eyes wide but calm. He didn't understand the gravity of the situation. All he knew was that he had been outside playing like any other child. Jason walked over to us, kneeling down beside Ethan. The tension in his body slowly faded as he reached out, brushing a strand of hair out of Ethan's face. For a moment, it was as if everything stopped. The world outside, the anger, the injustice. None of it mattered when Jason was holding Ethan. "I'm sorry you had to see that, buddy," Jason said quietly, his voice soft now, a stark contrast to the fire from moments before. Ethan smiled up at him. "It's okay, Daddy." "I'm okay." I watched them for a moment, feeling an overwhelming sense of gratitude and something else too, something I couldn't quite explain, a feeling of power that had been reclaimed. But I knew it wasn't over. Karen wasn't going to let this go. The fight wasn't just about her anymore. It was about us. About keeping my son safe, about standing up against someone who thought she could tear our family apart, and as much as I wanted to believe that everything would be fine, I knew better. I could feel it. The storm was coming. The aftermath wasn't what I expected. It was 2 days before the HOA sent us an official letter. Karen, in all her bitterness, had decided to take things further. The letter stated that the board was reviewing her complaint about loud, disruptive behavior and would be assessing the continued presence of your son in common areas. It was an official threat, backed up by a real possibility of action, whatever that meant. I could feel the weight of it in my chest, my stomach sinking with each word I read. Jason was livid when I showed it to him. "She's really going to try to pull this?" "After everything," he said, pacing back and forth across the living room. "This is insane." I could see the tension in his face, the muscles in his jaw twitching as he tried to keep his anger in check. But it was clear. Karen wasn't just trying to enforce a noise complaint. She was making a statement. She had power, and she wasn't going to give it up without a fight. But this time, Jason wasn't going to let her win. He immediately began gathering information, digging into HOA laws, seeking out legal advice. The first thing we learned was that while the HOA had authority over certain rules, they couldn't actually do much to us if we fought back. There were regulations in place for discrimination, for taking actions based on someone's disability. That was our lifeline. But even with this knowledge, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Every time I went outside with Ethan, I felt like we were being watched. Every time I caught a glimpse of Karen's house, I felt a ripple of anxiety tighten around my chest. The truth was, I couldn't avoid it any longer. This wasn't just about noise. It wasn't just about an argument with a neighbor. It was about something deeper, something more insidious. Karen's need for control. And that's why she wasn't going to back down. She didn't care about rules, about fairness. She cared about power. It wasn't long before the next encounter. I was walking Ethan down the sidewalk, his wheelchair rolling smoothly beneath us. The sun was just starting to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard. Everything seemed peaceful, but that was before I saw Karen. She was standing on her porch again, staring at us with that same cold, calculating expression. My stomach dropped. I didn't want this. I didn't want to feel like I had to brace myself every time I stepped outside, but Karen had made it impossible to feel safe. I turned to Jason, who had been walking behind us. "She's still watching," I muttered, feeling the old familiar tension creep back in. Jason nodded. He stepped forward, taking Ethan's hand in his, but he didn't take his eyes off Karen. "Let's keep walking," he said, his voice firm. "She doesn't get to control us." Not anymore. And so we kept walking, past Karen's house down the block, away from the scrutiny and the threats. And for the first time in days, I felt a sliver of relief. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The next few days passed in a blur of phone calls, paperwork, and meetings. Karen kept pushing, her demands growing more aggressive with every letter, every phone call to the HOA. But we were prepared. Jason made sure of that. With his military background, he knew how to fight with strategy. We gathered evidence, spoke to neighbors who had witnessed Karen's harassment, and presented our case to the HOA board. It didn't take long before the situation hit its breaking point. The HOA called a special meeting. It was our chance to make our case, and we weren't about to let Karen win. The meeting room was full of people, most of them indifferent, but a few were supportive. We had a few neighbors speak on our behalf, people who'd witnessed Karen's behavior firsthand. As Jason and I stood there, explaining how Karen's actions were not just about noise complaints, but about discrimination, I saw a few people shift uncomfortably in their seats. Some were clearly siding with us, others too afraid to speak up. But when the final vote was cast, I knew we had won. Karen's complaint was dismissed. The HOA issued a formal statement, apologizing for the undue stress she had caused. As part of the decision, Karen was removed from her position as president of the HOA, a move that was met with applause from the community. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. But the victory wasn't without its cost. The weeks that followed were filled with constant reflection. Karen's cruelty had left a mark on me, on us. Ethan, despite being too young to understand everything that had happened, knew enough to feel the strain. He would ask me, his small voice full of worry, "Are we okay, Mommy?" And each time, I would hold him tight and tell him we were okay, that everything was fine. But the truth was, it had changed us. It wasn't just the legal victory that gave me peace, though. It was the small moments, like watching Jason and Ethan in the backyard, tossing a ball back and forth, their laughter filling the air. Like seeing Ethan's face light up when he made it to the top of the ramp, finally pushing his toy car all the way down without help. Karen may have tried to break us, to take away the one thing that brought Ethan joy, but she had underestimated something powerful: love. The love of a father who would do anything to protect his family, the love of a mother who would fight for her child, and the love of a community that wouldn't stand for injustice. As I looked at my family, watching them together, I knew that no matter what Karen tried, she could never take away the strength we had. Not the love, not the bond we shared. That was something no one could ever control. The legal fight was behind us, but I knew it wasn't the end of the story. I didn't want anyone else to go through what we had. The fear, the helplessness, the feeling that the world was against us, it had to stop. I started speaking out, sharing our story, and getting involved in local advocacy groups for families with children who had disabilities. I learned how to raise my voice for others who couldn't fight back. I realized something important. Justice wasn't just about winning in court. It was about ensuring that no one, no matter who they were or where they lived, would be made to feel small, excluded, or unwanted because of who they were. Ethan had taught me that. Jason had taught me that. And now it was time for me to teach others. The hardest battles sometimes are the ones we don't see coming, but in the end, those battles can turn us into something stronger, something greater. And for that, I'll forever be grateful. It's been a year now. A full year since that day when everything changed. A lot has happened in that time. Some things have healed, and others, well, they still sting. but I've learned so much about strength, resilience, and what it really means to protect the ones you love. I've learned that pain isn't always something you overcome. Sometimes it's something you learn to live with, to grow from. What Karen did to us, the way she tried to tear us apart, it changed me. It made me stronger, yes, but it also made me more aware of the way people like her use power to hurt others. And I can't forget that. I can't let it go, not when there are so many others who might be going through the same thing. I remember one of the last conversations I had with Jason before everything died down. He sat with me in the kitchen, the light from the setting sun casting long shadows across the room. "I don't want you to forget what we've been through," he said, his voice soft but firm. "I know it's been a hell of a ride. But we've made it. And now it's our turn to help others make it too." At the time, I didn't fully understand what he meant, but now, I get it. We weren't just fighting for ourselves. We were fighting for people like Ethan, for families who don't have the strength or resources to fight back, for the kids who don't even know they're being hurt, not yet, but who will carry that pain for the rest of their lives if someone doesn't stand up. And so, I made a choice. I decided to make sure no one ever went through what we did without a voice. It started small. I began volunteering with advocacy groups, reaching out to families who were dealing with discrimination. I shared our story, not for pity, but to shed light on the reality of what it feels like to be targeted, and to show people that it's possible to fight back, even when you feel like the world is against you. Slowly, I gained confidence. Slowly, I started speaking up for others who couldn't speak for themselves. And then, I did something I never thought I would. I ran for a seat on the HOA board. I won't lie. It was hard. The same people who had stood by while Karen tried to ruin our lives weren't eager to hear my voice, but I was determined to change things. I didn't just want to be part of a system that controlled people with fear. I wanted to be the change. I wanted to fight for fairness, for equality, for everyone who had been silenced before. And I did it. I got on the board. And slowly, but surely, I began to make real changes. I introduced new rules that made the neighborhood more inclusive for everyone, especially families with children like Ethan. I made sure there were measures in place to prevent the kind of discrimination we faced from ever happening again. It wasn't easy, and there were times when I wanted to give up. The pressure, the constant scrutiny, it weighed on me. But every time I looked at Ethan, every time I saw that bright smile of his, every time I watched him roll his toy cars down a ramp or swing on the swings, I knew I couldn't stop. I couldn't let people like Karen win. When I see Ethan now, I see the same boy I've always known, curious, determined, full of life. He's grown so much. The therapy, the struggles, the setbacks, they've all shaped him, but they haven't defined him. Sometimes when we're sitting in the backyard, the sun setting and the cool evening air wrapping around us, I look at Ethan and I see a fighter. I see someone who, no matter what happens, will always find a way to move forward. And in that, I realize the greatest lesson I've learned throughout all of this. It's not the challenges we face that define us. It's how we rise to meet them, how we fight for what matters. Karen thought she could break us. She thought she could bend us to her will, that she could control us. But what she didn't understand, what she never could have understood, is that the love we have for each other is the one thing she could never take away. Our family, our love, our resilience, that's what kept us going. That's what made us stronger. And in the end, it wasn't just about fighting back against Karen. It was about protecting the heart of what truly mattered. When I think back on that time now, I don't just remember the anger or the fear or the fights. I remember the moments of clarity, the quiet after the storm, I remember Jason holding Ethan's hand and telling him everything was going to be okay, and I remember the strength in his voice, the certainty that no matter what happened, we'd face it together. And that's the story I want to share. That's the story I want to remember, because it's not about what was taken from us, it's about what we built in its place. As I stand here now, looking at my son, I realize that the journey we've been on, the one that started with a woman who tried to tear us down, has turned into something more beautiful than I could ever have imagined. And so, I'll leave you with this. Never let anyone make you feel small. Never let anyone take away your right to be who you are, to love who you love, or to live your life on your terms. And remember this: the power to fight back, to stand up for what's right, is always within you.